Okay, let's get started. I'm Andrew Riley, and I'm the Director of Drupal Development at MediaCurrent, and this is a talk about integrating AngularJS with Drupal 7. Now this talk isn't going to get too deep into Angular itself. We're going to talk about some of the concepts, but it's not an intro to Angular. If you don't know Angular, that's fine. You can still go and learn some stuff afterwards, but this is more about tying Angular into Drupal 7. Can I get a quick show of hands? Who here doesn't know what Angular is or isn't quite sure? Okay, so before we get into the Angles module, Angular is a JavaScript framework. It was created by Drupal, and it allows you to break up your code in a logical manner, as well as the big part for me is two-way data binding. So if you have an array of, let's just say first and last name, and you change some of that data, if it's via Ajax or something else, it will automatically update the data that's displayed on your screen. So you don't have to go back, re-render. It takes care of a lot of those things. So the two-way data binding is one of the biggest powers of Angular. Now, since Angular isn't really a Drupal project, it's kind of different. I created the Angles module to be able to easily use Angular in Drupal without having to change anything. I didn't want to take a standard Angular project and have it so you would have to go in and change everything around to make it fit Drupal. The Angles module, and just a disclaimer, it's still in a development release, and it's still got some things I'm going to talk about at the end that need to be done, but hopefully the demo will go well when I actually show you some of the things that the module does. So the Angles module is a Drupal module. The overall concept is, in Angular you have controllers, and for the Angular module, I just wanted to map the controllers to either a Drupal block or a pane for your panels. And since Drupal is pretty good at loading JavaScript, you can do your Drupal add.js and those types of things, I'm going to let Drupal handle loading the code. Might as well let it take care of doing that. So that way, if you say, I'm going to have a block that's an Angles block, it will take care of loading the associated JavaScript that Angular is going to need to run when that block is shown on a page. That way you can control really what items show up on web pages using the Drupal interface. It's not just something that lays on top of Drupal. The other thing is, with the Angles module, I didn't want to recreate the wheel. So if you need to do something like interact with some of the data with Drupal and Angular, you'd probably do some type of Ajax request. Now, the recreating the wheel part, I didn't feel that I need to actually write any code for it. You can use the stock services module for Drupal to be able to get that data in and out. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but there are some gotchas you got to watch out for when doing that. The other thing is AngularJS has its own built-in routing. So you can build your Angular application as a single-page application, if that's what you want to do using this module. You can use the built-in AngularJS routing, or you can do multiple Drupal pages and just kind of use it as you would a normal Drupal site and just load the blocks on those pages that you wish. It's really up to you how you want to use it. The other thing that happens with this is, both in controllers and directives, it inlines the data. So Angular has its own templates and template language, and they're actually very similar to the Twig curly brackets that go around it for most of the language processing. But what this module will do is, when you specify a block to use a certain controller, you can also specify to use a certain template. And what will happen? Well, Drupal behind the scenes will load up that template and cache it, and then display it on the page for you. So again, it's just another integration point for Drupal. While I have the talk of Drupal 8 up, there is some slight modifications you have to do if you're going to be running this Angular in Drupal 8, just because they both like using the exact same variable syntax as Twig and AngularJS templates, but that's going to be beyond the scope of this talk. So to install Angular, it uses the libraries module. So you, in your libraries directory, create a subdirectory called Angular and drop in your Angular min.js. Very soon, there will be actually handle both the minimized version of Angular and the full version. So depending on your debugging state, it will run with either. And there's a couple modules that come along with it. And it was written in this modular sense. So if you're a context person, blog person, great, you can use those. And very soon there will actually be a panels module, so you can add them as panes. So it's really up to you on how you want to use it. The block module is just that. It's very similar to menu block, or block menu. I always confuse them. But essentially, and I'll show that in just a little bit, you can define new blocks, and you just tell it, use this controller, use this template. The context module is entirely optional. You can use it if you want to. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. It does add a few extra things in there. When you create an Angular application, you need to put an ng app, a special attribute, into one of your HTML tags so Angular knows where to attach. Right now, the context module will let you take care of where that shows up, like on which pages you're going to have that Angular application. You don't have to do it that way if you want. If you want to do it somewhere else or differently, you could easily do it on the template layer. This one just makes it a nice user interface, so you can add in that ng app on specific pages, and it'll automatically add it to the body tag. That is one limitation because it does add it to the body tag. Some people like to put their ng app higher level, like the HTML tag, so they can modify other things or have access to other data. If you do that, I wouldn't recommend using the context module for that. Go ahead and take the theme route. So creating a module to work with the Angles module. Essentially what you're going to want to do are the steps that are listed up here. You want to create your custom module. You want to put your Angular files in a subdirectory of that module. You can really put them anywhere you want. And you can then add in the functions to your module that lets the Angular module know. The Angular module is looking for very specific hooks, so it knows what to load. Actually, I'm going to back up one. So real quick while we talk about structure. This is a great post, I forget who it's by, Brian Ford, talks about how to lay out your Angular application and where to put these scripts for, as he put it, for huge Angular apps. One of the things about the Angles module is it doesn't dictate which way you put it. I've implemented projects with this layout. It's great. It works just fine. But if you want to put everything in one directory, hey, that's your thing and you can do it. The module isn't going to force you to do it very specifically. Although I recommend organization. So talking about some of the important functions that you need to use in the Angles module. The first one is, well, it's kind of a hack function right now, but it gets the job done. So the hook Angles post load takes care of loading your, what's commonly known as the app.js, is your main application JavaScript file. And right now it's just done separately because it has to load after all your other JavaScript has been loaded. That's probably going to change in the future, but for right now that's how it is. The next one, the hook Angles controllers, allows you to define all of your controllers. Now, because these are hooks, you can have multiple modules define all of your controllers if you want. You can throw it in one. It's really up to you on how you want to do it. So let me bring up an example. Is that legible towards the back? Not so much? Any better now? Okay. So this is just an example module that I've defined here, and it has my hook controller. So we have our Angles module, but essentially I've made a almost like an Angles API type module, which takes care of loading all the things for it. So up on the controller, I've basically defined a machine name, a human name, and a path to the controller file. But you don't have to limit it to just the controller, because in Angular you have things like filters, directives, various types of services. You have a lot of different files that you can load. So you can technically, if you had a filter, so we only wanted to include people that only had the first name of Bill, and and for some reason we wrote a filter for that, you can define all the JavaScript files to load. So anytime this controller is called, the files that are listed there will be loaded via Drupal add.js into the system for you. So again, that's just a way to be able to move the controllers around, put them on the pages you want, and let Drupal take care of the worrying about which files are loaded on which pages. The counterpart to the Angles controller is the templates file, or templates hook. And it allows you to show out the various template files, or list out the various template files that are used. So go into those. You'll find that it's actually very, very, very similar to it. You're basically going to have an array with your machine name and human name. Right now I have them the same on this one. And a list out to the template. You'll notice that though, this one is slightly different. The file for the template is not an array. You can only have one template defined per parent array entry. Sometimes you might wonder like why where you're going to have templates defined like this. It actually allows us some flexibility when it comes to directives. Because when you have a controller, you can define a template to show up, and it does. Directives are almost like little baby controllers that are slightly different, but we can actually preload or inline those template HTMLs into the page. We'll go into it in a little bit, but this gives us the flexibility to use a template where we want and how we want it. And it also gives us the ability to use different templates for the same controller, or the same controller to use different templates. So it gives us that flexibility to change out the display layer versus the underlying logic. And then the final important hook is the Angles require. This is kind of a catch-all function, if you will, to load additional JS files. They may be libraries that are Angular related, they may be something else that's not Angular related, but it essentially is a quick way just to load in files on any page that has one of the Angular controllers being loaded either via block or a panel. It will automatically call that. That differs a little than if you were putting it in the actual info file, because that would load it on every page. Anything that's in the Angles require function will only load on pages that have some Angular code being loaded. So, how to create a controller block? Essentially, you want to select your controller, select your template, and I'm sorry, right now in development, it's not exportable with features, but it is on the roadmap soon to be exportable, so you can have a feature of your controller blocks that you create. So to go over to our site, this is always the risky part, live demo. So you can see right up here at the top we have our add angles block. You click on there and it'll let you create a new block. I'll just call it example. And then you'll notice here, because it's an Angular block, it has these drop downs. So you can choose which template you want to use and which controller you want to use. And again, if you have multiple templates, multiple controllers, they'll just show up in that drop down list. So I'm just using some ones I've already created. And I'll save it. And at this point, we have a block. You can use it how you want. If you wanted to use the core block placement, you could. It would work just fine. But we're going to go ahead and use context on it. So in this case, I have the context module enabled and the Angles context module enabled. Context at this resolution is fun. I already have the path for the front page loaded in there. But we have a few Angular-based reactions that we can do. The first one that we're going to want to do is, again, I talked about you can put it directly in the HTML, or you could use the actual context module to do it. So I hope I named that one right. So this one is just called MAM, it's my development one. I have no idea what it means. But I'm going to save that, the app name. And did I mention I'm on a development environment? We'll just pretend that worked and I didn't have to add that. Okay. So if we take a look at the actual homepage of the site, you'll see here that in the body tag, the context reaction is taken care of adding that ng app MAO. One of the fun things with that is when I first started Angular, actually finding that this is required, it should be in big blinking letters on the Angular website. It's not really. So if for some reason your controllers aren't loading, check to make sure you define your application name. And with that control or that reaction in context, there's no way to define it to show up anywhere other than the body. Angular does technically allow you to have multiple applications per page. It's not recommended though, because then you have to do quite a few difficult things. You have to mess with the Angular bootstrap to get that to actually happen. So in the interest of trying to keep things easy and working for 99% of the sites out there, I just made it so you can find only one application per page. If you need to do otherwise, I'd recommend you look at something other than this context module. So now I'm going to take care of going back into my context. And because it's just a block, you can choose your blocks. And there it is. You'll see under Angles block, you can go ahead and add in the manual block we created. And then if we go to our home page, we now have our template showing up and any of our controller code loading. So it's pretty easy to actually get up and running and start loading the AngularJS code, getting it displayed in something that's somewhat Drupal aware without having to completely change out how your Angular works. So pretty much if you wrote your Angular properly and it works on just a generic HTML page, you can probably get it into Drupal without too much of a problem. So the preloading of JS blocks. So directives in Angular are kind of small controllers. And there's a couple different ways that you can put the template in your directive. You can directly embed it in the controller JavaScript, which I generally try to stay away from. It's messy. Just like no one wants HTML in their PHP, you probably don't want HTML inside of your JavaScript file. So the alternate way is you can have a template defined that goes and references the, here we go. So you can have a template URL defined here in your directive, it's on line 14, that tells it where to go to get this template file. So hey, that solves our problem of having embedded HTML inside of our directive, but we just invented a new problem. We now have another request that has to go to the server, round trip, load, then process. So it slows it down, increases the load on your server. It's just generally not the best solution. There is another way to work around this. So we got rid of the embedded code. We're telling it to reference this other HTML file, but we don't want to have another request. We use a thing called an ng template. So the ng template is a way to load the data of this template into the Drupal page. And that's the context that showed, or the error that showed up in the context before. So I'm going to take a look. So if we add an Angles ng template, remember we've already defined all of our templates in the hook Angles template. So we can actually tell it to basically preload the HTML. So in this case, I'm preloading the one that it's referencing called a button. I'm going to go into the source code real quick.
So is that getting cached?
It is getting cached. So you can see here, it's just putting a script tag in there, and it's giving it the type of text ng template, and that's a standard. I know it's somewhat less than ideal of having it be a type text ng template, but what it does is it puts the ID on there, and it puts the ID in the path to that file. anything that would tell Angular to go out and get the template from that directory will automatically pull it from what's already in the DOM and use that. So essentially, it's already being loaded in the page, being cached by Drupal, and already in the page, and we're stopping another HTTP request and waiting for it. And the users don't really see it, so it just shows up there in the code. So it's a good way to get around one of the processing and loading problems. And yeah, it's nice and efficient. Oh yeah, and if right now, based on the state of the module, if you are going to use that ng template, you do need to use the Angles context module to be able to load it. Once panels is in there completely, it will be a little different, and you can use either, but for right now, you can only do that. So remember, if you're using the context module, you're going to be using it to define the application name or preload an ng template. Other than that, it doesn't do anything special. So quick review of the ng app. Remember, we can only have one per page. Context will be adding it to the body page, and you generally don't want to have more than one ng app per page. And if you do, you might want to rethink why you do. And if you really know why you do, then you probably know how to work around that anyway. So
can you have multiple blocks per app?
Yes. So some of the projects we've done will have, let's just say I have a menu as a controller, and that would be a block. So we would load that in the sidebar, and then we might have a couple more controllers in the main content area or a right bar. So you can stack your blocks as many as you want on the page as long as they're in scope of your app. And again, you can also do that per page, or you can use the Angular method of using a routing script to say this URL, show these. If you're going to use the built-in Angular routing, you're going to want to essentially load all your controllers in that page because it's going to be a one-page app. So let's talk a little bit about some of the gotchas. It wasn't too painful of a process adapting Angular to Drupal. There's a few things that you need to make sure you know. Is now, due to security reasons, the services module requires a CSRF token to actually post, update, delete, and those types of write operations to the services module. There's a URL that you can go and get from the services module that gives you that token. You can cache it in Angular, you can use a cookie, whatever method you deem useful, do that. But the kind of hard part is it's kind of difficult when you're sending out, let's say you have a few different factories that are going to write out some stuff to your server. You really want to go through your 12 different factories, and every time you're doing a post to the server, add in some code to say, add in the CSRF token. No, that's not fun. It doesn't really scale well. You're going to forget it somewhere. But there is a way around it. So here's a little bit of script of JavaScript, and one of the nice things about Angular, if you're not too familiar with it, is with the exception of a few parts of Angular, you don't have to really learn another language. It's all pretty much just default JavaScript with a few special object handlers and some other things. So this little batch of code up here is basically saying anytime we do an HTTP request, if we're doing a post, a put, or a delete, we're automatically going to append that CSRF token. So it's just a nice, quick, and easy way to put it across all of your writing type requests to go ahead and change that out. It was a lifesaver finding this. And if you're not familiar with Angular and you're more of a jQuery person, definitely read up on variables with $ versus not $ in Angular. It's not like not like jQuery. Another thing that we found, always dates and times are just never fun to work with. They always come up with weird things. But if you're going from Angular or JavaScript, this isn't necessarily Angular specific, watch out when you're saving from JavaScript to Drupal. On your date objects, you want to avoid your getTime call that dumps it out in milliseconds since 1970. So that's kind of the fun part. Is JavaScript stores the time in milliseconds since that date, whereas PHP stores it in seconds since that date. If you don't watch that, you can have a lot of fun of wondering why all your dates get mangled every time you save it and load it up if you're not doing the conversions. But if you followed my advice and don't use get time anyway, you can use toUtc string. And I recommend the toUtc string because PHP can decode it. Yes, it's bigger and it's kind of weird looking, but when you send that back and forth between JavaScript and Drupal services, it's kind of a nice intermediary format. There are some newer methods to the date object that will put it out in some other strings, but a lot of them haven't been used or haven't been adopted for anything IE8 or below. And we're always limited by that lowest common denominator. So the toUtc string seems to be pretty well supported by Internet Explorer, so you can still use it in the older versions. And ultimately, you never want to transfer it as seconds or milliseconds because that's just asking for a world of pain. Also, you want to remember when you're setting up your Angular services and you have your entities, you want to think how they're going to be processing. Because you might think, you know what, I'm going to set up a factory in Angular that's going to be tied to people in my organization. And that's good because you seem to have a one-to-one mapping. Actually, I think Ryan's will talk about this later at 2 o'clock. But you need to think about how you're actually going to be saving that data. If you're going to update something in Angular, you're going to put a post or an update out there, it's going to send it out to Drupal. But remember, JavaScript is asynchronous. If you send out a couple posts, they might not necessarily be sent or received or processed in the order that you actually triggered them. So if you have any relationships, especially entity relationships between different types, you've got to be very careful because if you say, you know what, I'm going to post a new person to my database, but I'm also, this new person, they're a part of this club. The club doesn't exist, so I'm going to post a new club. What happens if your club gets processed before the person does and they were related? You can't have a club without having a person being in charge of it. So you got to watch out for those types of systems. There's a couple of different ways you can get around it. One is less than ideal. You can work with promises to make sure that your AJAX always goes in a certain order. I highly recommend, or highly discourage that one because you're kind of getting rid of all the goodness that is asynchronous. Probably the better way to do it is to plan out your entities and how the relationships are done, and then plan out your services that if you do need to do something like send a club and a person, you can probably send that in one request, and then make sure that on the Drupal side, the person is created first, then the club is created. So just pay attention to that. It's an easy gotcha if you think your services in Angular are going to be one-to-one to your entity and to your Drupal service. It's not always the case. So let's talk a little bit about the future Angles module because it is pretty young. So one of the big things that I'm going to be adding is the panel support. And it is an additional module. So you can really use it how you want to, and we don't have tons of, thousands of lines of code that you're not going to use if you don't want to use it that way. So you can choose if you want to use the context or blocks method or those together or panels, or if you wanted to, you can use all three and it would still work. So it's made to be flexible and not really lock you into just one way of processing it. This one is the one I'm most excited about. Who here knows about Yeoman and what it does? Okay, great. This is going to be awesome. It will rock your world. Yeoman comes with a thing called generators, and it's a little node application that you can do, and you can type in yo generate Angular, and it'll actually create a scaffolding of an Angular project for you. You can have it generate Express projects. You can have it generate all different types of things. But it saves you a lot of time of creating those files, those empty objects, all the various things that you do when you set up. That's really painful, and you always have to look up in the documentation. So I'm also working on a generator module. And what that will do is so you can say, yo, angles, and it'll actually create the Drupal module for you, that API module, that has the functions in there and a couple example scripts that are all tied in. So literally within 20 seconds, you can generate it and then go and enable your modules and actually have your site showing Angular code. So it just saves that time that no one really likes spending on those types of things. And one of our favorites, and I know this is a big for enterprise projects, is exportables. So for the ones, if you don't know, exportables allow you to export the information or configuration into features. So you could actually save out your Angles blocks configuration to features, so you can easily transfer it between servers or enable them, disable them. So that's in the works very soon, probably in about a week, that exportable code will come out, so you can use it. Okay, that's all I have prepared. Does anyone have any questions? There.
Why wouldn't you just use an example module in place of the Yeoman?
Okay, so the question was why wouldn't you just use an Angles example application out there rather than using Yeoman? Because this will create the Drupal module for you. It will create essentially the Angles scaffold that would be very similar to an example one you could download, but it creates the Drupal module along with it that will then have, let me bring it up for you. That will then like do these things like define your templates for you.
Inside of that could be like Angles, for example, project that would have scaffolding.
It could, yeah. There could be like example ones that you could just copy out. This is just it's a throw over to its JavaScript roots that a lot of applications now use the trinity of Yeoman, Bower, and Grunt together. So this is more of a peace offering to the JavaScript people that are coming to Drupal. Any other questions? Okay, if not, oh, sorry.
Can you give us a real world example of where this is useful? You show how we do it. What can it do? Show us how.
Well, that's going to be hard to do in an example here.
You could just explain
Which scenario?
just explain a scenario like a business case for whatever.
Okay. The question was, what would be a good example of why we would use this and how we would use it? So, like an example would be if you had a calendar of your various classes that were going to be going on. In this case, and this is historical, we've done this, the user logs into the Drupal site. They have their basic calendar template as a Angular template. That information is actually grabbed from a service and loaded in and rendered into their calendar, and it shows there. Now that you could do with just core Drupal, that's not really anything special. But what we did is we had it actually checking back to the server. You can do this in various methods, but they wanted the calendar to be live. So if a teacher added something to your calendar or said there's going to be a seminar this week, they wanted it to automatically show up on the page without having to refresh. So in this case, we had some Ajax firing off in the background, checking every so often for updates. If there was an update, it just pulled in that information. Because Angular has the two-way data binding, as soon as that information was put into the array of upcoming events, it was automatically updated on the page for that person. So it allows you to have a dynamic execution on the front-end side that's pretty nice. That you could do server-side, but this way you don't have to. The other thing about this specific project that we're referring to is this all worked offline. It was also using local storage. So your calendar was all there. You could see what your upcoming projects were. You could even add them. And then once you reconnected, it synced all that data back to Drupal, and Drupal then saved it off. So that was actually one of the big components of it, was the offline part. Yes?
This may be too broad of a question for this context, but I'm wondering if you could speak to why you would integrate Angular tightly coupled with Drupal versus writing a completely different front end and using Angular's HTTP service to make REST calls.
That's a good question. So the question is, why tightly integrate with Drupal versus do some other type of front end and maybe integrate with just the REST side of Drupal? That really depends on the project. In the case of the example I just used, they were using the user management and they wanted people to log into Drupal, but then just use the Drupal front end. So they wanted to use Drupal, but also had the Angular have their cake and eat it too. There are ways to work around that. You can easily do logins with services and those types of things. But this one, it was kind of a hybrid type project. And in some instances, you could also just use it without the login, and you could just do this on top of Drupal and really cache things, and then just use it almost as a templating engine. Does anyone else have any questions? Going once? Going twice? Oh, okay.
Will your slides be available?
Yes, I will be posting these slides probably in the next hour on the Drupal Camp Atlanta site. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.